Hello, I'm Gary Libecap of the University of California at Santa Barbara, the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I want to talk about some non-traditional bottom-up ways or bottoms-up way to deal with natural resource and environmental problems. These are associated with Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991, and then Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009. She co-shared that with Oliver Williamson. Elinor Ostrom's approach to environmental and resource problems was to look at local users and local communities to see how they solve problems. Because in many cases, the community has a great stake in protecting a fish stock or a forest or a groundwater basin. And so the communities, because the numbers are small, the communities are homogeneous, can devise their own rules. Ronald Coase was interested in broader problems that extended for many environmental and resource problems that went beyond individual communities to many parties, where some of the approaches of Elinor Ostrom's might not be so useful. But at the same time, his approach was also a bottoms-up one, and it emphasized the assignment of a property right effectively and allowing for bargaining rather than a top-down regulatory mandate. In Ronald Coase's 1960 paper, The Problem of Social Cost, he developed his arguments around a few examples, all ones of standard externalities. Straying cattle, where the cattle strayed into the farmer's fields. Air pollution from a factory that was damaging laundry and other property around the factory. And railroad sparks that ignited fires and damaged the local countryside. The standard top-down response would be to regulate the railroad, regulate the factory's emissions, regulate the rancher or the herder. It could be, though, that in fact the reduced production by the rancher, the factory, or the railroad could impose more costs on society than the problem that they were trying to solve. In other words, the production that was protected in terms of the farmer or the laundry or the property around the factory or the property adjacent to the railroad was less valuable actually than the regulated parties. But if we use a polluter pays rule, which is the traditional way to think about or respond to environmental problems, then that's what we'll do. But Coase said, no, that might not maximize general welfare, that it might in fact be the case that we want to have the beneficiary pay, not have the polluter pay. And why might that be beneficial? Well, if the beneficiary has to pay nothing, so we're going to levy costs totally on the polluter, then why not have perfectly pure water, perfectly clean air, no sparks from any railroad and so forth? We can actually have way too much environmental regulation, imposing way too many costs on society. On the other hand, if the parties that are going to benefit have to pay to benefit, then they can weigh exactly how much air pollution reduction they want, how much reduced cattle straying into the farmers' fields that takes place, and so forth. So we may get the more optimal amount of environmental and natural resource pollution, because we'll always have some, as compared to the case where an interest group mandates a certain amount of regulation that may impose high costs on society. And in Coase's argument, he said, really this problem is a reciprocal one. It's not recognized in a polluter pays argument. Why might we think that the farmer has the right to deny the herder, or that the herder has the right to deny the farmer? In either of those cases, we're assigning a property right implicitly. Or in the case of the factory and the properties around the factory has the right to pollute, or the properties around the factory have the right to clean air. Now that might seem self-evident to us, but actually the overall effects of the regulation could make us worse off, as I mentioned. And so what Coase said, let's take the approach that maximizes general welfare. And so he was pretty agnostic about whether you use regulation or tax policies or what's been called basically Coasean bargaining. But he really thought Coasean bargaining deserved a lot more attention than it has been given. And essentially in that case, the property owners around the factory would bargain with the factory owner to get the factory owner to reduce pollution. Or in the case of the farmer and the rancher, or the farmer and the farmer and the herder would bargain in terms of the amount of grazing that the herder might have on the farmer's land and so forth. Grazing or environmental costs, then in the case where these were imposed in a top-down setting at the insistence of a particular interest group or agency. So in Coase's case, he was explicitly concerned about the transactions costs. He was not, if transactions costs were low, then he was really agnostic about who got the right, whether it was the farmer or the herder or the factory owner and the surrounding property owners, because in either case we'd get the optimal solution. And that became known as the Coase theorem, even though he did not mention that in his article. Now, many environmental economists and policymakers dismiss Coasean solutions as actually involving high transactions costs. And so they immediately default to the standard regulatory approach. But that approach can be very costly. And so it isn't necessarily the case that a bargaining setting isn't going to be the best way to proceed. And so let me give you two examples of where a Coasean approach has gained a considerable acceptance. One is in fisheries, where we assign an overall cap on fishing, total annual harvest, or total annual catch, and then assign shares to fishers in that total allowable harvest, tradable shares. And so that allows the fishers to figure out who will actually fish, and they can buy and sell and trade and actually reduce the number of vessels with the most efficient fishers remaining. And because these shares only have value if the stock itself is protected, then they have an inherent right themselves, or an inherent interest in protecting the fish stock. Unlike in the case of regulation, where they actually have to fish as rapidly as they can before the regulatory agency comes down on them to halt their fishing. So in the case of fisheries, we have a lot of strong evidence of the value of this. In the case of air pollution, we have what's called cap and trade. You're all familiar with this in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. The best example in terms of effectiveness was with the sulfur dioxide program in the United States, implemented after 1990. Previously, there had been a nationwide cap on sulfur dioxide emissions and requirements that all electric utilities adopt scrubbers. It was very costly, and they were not meeting the objective. But with the cap and trade program, utilities in any part of the country could trade their emission permits. And so what that meant was that utilities that could respond in the lowest cost way actually did so, reducing their emissions, and they'd have some leftover emission permits that then they could trade to parties or utilities that could meet the restrictions only at higher cost. But since they had to bear higher costs, it gave them incentives to innovate. But no regulator was mandating the way in which they innovated. The market would determine how the parties responded to the mandate. Now, one problem or issue that arises in these cap and trade schemes is how you allocate the permits, whether you grandfather them, assigning them to past users, or you auction them. Grandfathering has a lot of advantages in that it allows the market to determine the size of the units. Auctioning has some advantages in the sense that it generates revenues for the state. But in either case, these are two Coasean approaches to standard regulatory problems.